Welcome, friends. Today we embark on a journey unlike any we've taken before. Across cemeteries, memorial parks, and sacred grounds from coast to coast and beyond, we'll visit the final resting places of 50 famous people whose lives were cut short not by illness or old age, but by the violent hand of another. These are actors and musicians, presidents and activists, athletes and artists, all of them taken too soon. Their stories are sometimes shocking, sometimes heartbreaking, and always worth remembering. So settle in. We have a long road ahead of us, and our first stop is one of the most hallowed sites in all of New York City. There is no headstone, there is no grave. When John Lennon was cremated after his murder on December 8, 1980, his ashes were given to Yoko Ono, and she chose to scatter them in Central Park, in the area now known as Strawberry Fields. If you visit today, you'll find the iconic black and white mosaic bearing the single word Imagine set into the pathway just across from the Dakota apartment building where Lennon lived and where he was killed. It has become one of the most visited memorials in the world, adorned year-round with flowers, candles, and handwritten notes from fans who never stopped loving his music. Lennon, of course, was one of the founding members of the Beatles, the band that changed popular music forever. From I Wanna Hold Your Hand to Let It Be, from Strawberry Fields Forever to A Day in the Life, the Beatles dominated the 1960s in a way no musical act had before, or arguably has since. Their appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show in February 1964 drew 73 million viewers and changed the trajectory of American popular culture. As one half of the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership, John helped compose some of the most beloved songs in the English language. But Lennon was always the provocative one, the sharp-tongued iconoclast who pushed boundaries, musically, politically, personally. After the band dissolved in 1970, he launched a solo career that produced some of the most enduring songs in rock history, including Imagine, which has become something of an alternative national anthem for idealists everywhere, as well as Instant Karma, Mind Games, and the raw confessional Plastic Ono Band album. He was also an outspoken peace activist, famously staging bed-ins for peace with Yoko during the Vietnam War era, a publicity stunt that was mocked at the time but now seems remarkably prescient. By 1975, Lennon had stepped away from music entirely to raise his son Sean, an act of devotion that was unusual for a rock star of his stature. He spent 5 years as what he called a house husband, baking bread and changing diapers in the Dakota apartment. Then, in 1980, he came roaring back with Double Fantasy, an album he made with Yoko that crackled with renewed energy and optimism. The comeback felt like the beginning of a brilliant new chapter. It was not to be. On the evening of December 8, 1980, as John and Yoko returned to the Dakota from a recording session at the record plant, a 25-year-old man named Mark David Chapman was waiting in the archway of the building. Chapman had actually approached Lennon earlier that same day, around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and Lennon had graciously signed his copy of Double Fantasy. A photographer named Paul Goresh captured the moment. Lennon, wearing a leather jacket, bending to write his autograph, with Chapman standing right beside him, holding the album. It is one of the most chilling photographs in rock history. Hours later, when Lennon returned, Chapman drew a Charter Arms revolver and fired 5 shots, 4 of which struck Lennon in the back and shoulder. Lennon staggered up the steps into the Dakota's vestibule and collapsed. He was rushed to Roosevelt Hospital in a police car but was pronounced dead on arrival. He was 40 years old. The news spread across the world within minutes, and crowds began gathering outside the Dakota, singing Lennon's songs and weeping openly. Howard Cosell broke the news to millions during Monday Night Football, and the stunned silence that followed was perhaps the truest measure of what the world had lost. Chapman pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 20 years to life. He remains in prison to this day, having been denied parole more than 15 times. When asked why he did it, Chapman said he wanted the fame that would come from killing the most famous rock star in the world. He got the infamy. The world got Strawberry Fields, that simple mosaic in Central Park, always adorned with flowers, where people still gather on December 8th each year to remember a man who asked us to imagine a world without violence and who did not get to live in one. From New York, let's travel across the country to Los Angeles, to one of the most infamous addresses in American crime history, 10050 Cielo Drive in Benedict Canyon. That was the home where actress Sharon Tate was murdered on August 9, 1969, along with 4 others, in a crime that shocked the nation and effectively ended the peace and love spirit of the 1960s. Tate is buried at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City, California, a beautiful Catholic cemetery that is the final resting place of many Hollywood figures. Sharon Tate was one of the most promising young actresses in Hollywood. She had studied acting with Jeff Corey, whose students included Jack Nicholson and James Dean, and she brought an uncommon warmth and intelligence to her roles. She first attracted attention in the occult thriller Eye of the Devil in 1966, and her most notable film was the 1967 cult classic Valley of the Dolls, which earned her a Golden Globe nomination for Most Promising Newcomer. She was also well received in the comedic spy film The Wrecking Crew alongside Dean Martin, and in The Fearless Vampire Killers, directed by Roman Polanski, the man she would marry. At just 26, she seemed to have everything: beauty, talent, a successful husband, and a baby on the way. She was 8.5 months pregnant with their first child. On the night of August 8, 1969, while Polanski was in London working on a film, members of Charles Manson's cult descended on the house at Cielo Drive. The killers, Charles Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, and Patricia Krenwinkel, were following Manson's orders, though the precise motive has been debated for decades. They murdered Tate along with her friends Jay Sebring, a celebrity hairdresser; Abigail Folger, the coffee heiress and social activist; Wojtek Frykowski, a Polish writer; and Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old who had been visiting the property's caretaker. The violence that night was unspeakable. The following night, the same group killed Leno and Rosemary LaBianca in their Los Feliz home. The killings sent a wave of terror through Los Angeles. For months before the Manson connection was established, the city lived in fear. Manson and several of his followers were convicted of the murders in 1971 and sentenced to death, which was later commuted to life in prison when California temporarily abolished capital punishment. Manson died in prison in 2017. The Manson case became one of the most infamous criminal stories of the 20th century, spawning countless books, documentaries, films, and even a Quentin Tarantino movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, in which Margot Robbie portrayed Tate with a radiant tenderness. Tate's mother, Doris, spent the rest of her life advocating for victims' rights and attending parole hearings for Manson family members. In a touching detail, Doris was eventually buried beside her daughter at Holy Cross. Sharon Tate's grave remains a place of quiet reflection for those who remember a young woman whose life and career were barely beginning. Let's step back in time now, far back, to Springfield, Illinois and the Oak Ridge Cemetery, where one of the most consequential figures in American history rests in an imposing tomb that has become a national historic landmark. This is the final resting place of Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, the man who preserved the Union and signed the Emancipation Proclamation. On the evening of April 14, 1865, just 5 days after General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox effectively ended the Civil War, Lincoln attended a performance of the comedy Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington with his wife Mary. It was supposed to be a night of celebration and relaxation. The war was over. The Union was preserved. The president, who had aged visibly during the 4 brutal years of conflict, was looking forward to a quiet evening of laughter. But the actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth had other plans. Booth, a well-known stage performer and the son of one of America's most famous theatrical families, had been plotting for months, first a kidnapping scheme and then, after the Confederacy's defeat, assassination. He knew Ford's Theater intimately, having performed there many times, and he knew the layout of the presidential box. During the third act, while a single guard assigned to protect the president had wandered away from his post, Booth slipped into the box, pressed a single-shot Derringer pistol to the back of Lincoln's head, and fired. He then leapt from the box to the stage, catching his spur on the bunting and breaking his leg in the fall, and reportedly shouted a line that has echoed through history. He escaped through the back of the theater on horseback. Lincoln was carried across the street to the Peterson boarding house, where doctors attended to him through the night. He never regained consciousness and died the following morning at 7:22 a.m. He was 56 years old, the first American president to be assassinated. Booth was tracked to a barn in Virginia 12 days later and was shot dead by Union soldiers. Several of his co-conspirators were hanged, including Mary Surratt, the first woman executed by the United States federal government. Lincoln's funeral train carried his body on a winding 13-day journey from Washington back to his home state of Illinois, retracing the route he had taken to the Capitol 4 years earlier. The train stopped in cities along the way, and millions of Americans lined the tracks and stood in viewing lines that stretched for blocks. Lincoln is entombed at Oak Ridge Cemetery alongside his wife Mary and 3 of their 4 sons. The tomb has had its share of drama even after Lincoln's death. In 1876, a group of counterfeiters attempted to steal his body and hold it for ransom, a plot that was foiled by Secret Service agents. After that scare, Lincoln's remains were eventually embedded in a concrete vault 10 feet below the floor to prevent any future attempts. From the hallowed ground of a presidential tomb, let's make our way to the warmth of Southern California, to Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale. This sprawling cemetery is the resting place of many of Hollywood's greatest stars. But today we're here for a man often called the King of Soul. Sam Cooke rests here, and his story is one of the most mysterious and heartbreaking in all of American music. If you grew up listening to the radio in the late 50s and early 60s, you know Sam Cooke's voice. It was smooth, powerful, and unmistakable. Hits like You Send Me, Chain Gang, Cupid, Twistin' the Night Away, and Wonderful World made him one of the most popular singers in America, beloved by black and white audiences alike at a time when that was no small feat. Cooke was also a savvy businessman, one of the first black artists to start his own record label and publishing company, giving him control over his own music. He was deeply involved in the civil rights movement, and his posthumously released song, A Change Is Gonna Come, became one of the great anthems of the era. On the night of December 11, 1964, Cooke was shot and killed by the manager of a Los Angeles motel called the Hacienda. The official story was that Cooke had entered the motel office in a rage, and the manager, Bertha Franklin, shot him in self-defense. The coroner's inquest ruled it a justifiable homicide, but Cooke's friends and family never accepted that version of events, and questions about what really happened that night have lingered for more than 60 years. He was just 33. Cooke was inducted as a charter member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1986, and the Songwriters Hall of Fame honored him the following year. His influence can be heard in the music of Otis Redding, Aretha Franklin, Marvin Gaye, Al Green, and countless others who followed in his footsteps. Our journey now takes us to Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia, but not to visit a soldier or a president. We're here for Medgar Evers, one of the most important figures in the American civil rights movement, a man whose assassination in 1963 galvanized a nation. Evers was the field secretary for the NAACP in Mississippi, a position that placed him squarely in the crosshairs of white supremacists who were determined to maintain the segregated status quo. In that role, he investigated the murder of Emmett Till, a name we'll encounter later on this tour, organized voter registration drives, led boycotts of businesses that refused to serve black customers, and fought for the integration of the University of Mississippi. He did all of this knowing that every day could be his last. On the night of June 12, 1963, Evers pulled into the driveway of his home in Jackson, Mississippi, carrying an armful of Jim Crow Must Go t-shirts. A white supremacist named Byron de la Beckwith was hiding in a thicket of honeysuckle across the street with a high-powered rifle. He shot Evers in the back. The bullet passed through Evers' body. traveled through a window of his home, ricocheted off a refrigerator, and came to rest on a kitchen counter. Evers managed to crawl to the front door before collapsing. He died at a nearby hospital less than an hour later. He was 37 years old. De la Beckwith stood trial twice in the 1960s, but both trials ended in hung juries. All white juries, it should be noted. It was not until 1994, more than 30 years after the murder, that de la Beckwith was finally convicted, largely thanks to the tireless efforts of the Evers family. Medgar Evers was buried at Arlington with full military honors, recognizing his service as a sergeant in the United States Army during World War II. Shifting gears considerably, let's head to the desert southwest, to Scottsdale, Arizona. Here, at the now closed Scottsdale Memorial Gardens, lies a man known to millions as the wisecracking Colonel Hogan. Bob Crane, star of the hit television series Hogan's Heroes, was murdered in this very city in 1978, and his case remains one of Hollywood's most baffling, unsolved crimes. Hogan's Heroes ran on CBS from 1965 to 1971, and it made Crane a household name. The show, a comedy set in a German prisoner of war camp during World War II, was an unlikely hit, but audiences loved it, and Crane's charm and comedic timing were central to its appeal. Before television, Crane had been a popular radio disc jockey in Connecticut and Los Angeles, known for his love of jazz and big band music. After Hogan's Heroes was canceled, Crane struggled to find roles that matched his earlier success. In June of 1978, he was in Scottsdale performing in a touring stage play called Beginner's Luck. On the morning of June 29th, he was found bludgeoned to death in his apartment. He was 49. The prime suspect for decades was John Henry Carpenter, a video equipment salesman who had been a close friend of Crane's and was the last person known to have seen him alive. Carpenter was not charged until 1994, and when the case finally went to trial, he was acquitted due to insufficient evidence. Carpenter died in 1998, and the murder officially remains unsolved. Bob Crane was initially buried in Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles, but his family later had his remains moved to a different location. From the Arizona desert, let's travel to the Gulf Coast of Texas, to Corpus Christi, and then onward to the town of Lake Jackson. Here, at Mount Park Cemetery, is the final resting place of a young woman who became the most celebrated Tejano artist of all time, a superstar whose murder at age 23 sent millions of fans into mourning. Her name was Selena. Selena Quintanilla Perez was born in Lake Jackson, Texas, and grew up performing with her family's band, Selena High Los Dinos, at local events, weddings, quinceañeras, and small venues throughout South Texas. Her father Abraham, a former musician himself, recognized her talent early and pushed hard for her success, even pulling her out of school so she could tour full-time. It was a sacrifice that paid off spectacularly. By the early 1990s, Selena had become the undisputed queen of Tejano music, a genre that blended Mexican musical traditions with American pop, country, and rhythm and blues. Her live performances were electric. She was a magnetic presence on stage, dancing with an energy and joy that was irresistible. Her 1994 album, Amor Prohibido, went platinum and produced 4 number-1 singles on the Billboard Top Latin Songs chart. That same year, she won a Grammy for Best Mexican American Album for Selena Live, making her the first Tejano artist to win the award. She was on the cusp of crossing over into the mainstream English language market. Her English language album was nearly complete, and EMI Records had invested heavily in what they believed would be her breakthrough to a massive new audience. She had also launched a clothing line and opened boutiques in Corpus Christi and San Antonio, demonstrating a business savvy unusual for an artist so young. But behind the scenes, trouble was brewing. Yolanda Saldivar, the president of Selena's fan club and manager of her clothing boutiques, had been stealing money from the businesses. When fans began complaining that they weren't receiving the merchandise they had ordered through the fan club, Selena and her family confronted Saldivar about the financial discrepancies. On March 31, 1995, Selena drove to the Days Inn Motel in Corpus Christi to meet with Saldivar and retrieve financial records. During the confrontation, Saldivar pulled a .38 caliber revolver from her purse and shot Selena once in the back as the singer turned to leave. The bullet severed an artery, and Selena staggered to the lobby, leaving a trail of blood, and managed to name her assailant before collapsing. She was rushed to a hospital, but had lost too much blood. She died during surgery. She was 23 years old. Saldivar fled the motel and barricaded herself in her pickup truck in the parking lot, holding the gun to her own head. A 9.5-hour standoff with police ensued before she finally surrendered. She was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. She was denied parole in 2025. In the years since Selena's death, her legend has only grown. A biographical film starring Jennifer Lopez was released in 1997, introducing Selena to millions who had never heard Tejano music. A Netflix series followed in 2020. Her music continues to sell millions of copies, and she has been honored with a posthumous star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. She remains an icon, particularly in the Latino community, and her grave draws visitors from around the world who leave flowers, candles, and notes of devotion. Now let's head west to Las Vegas, or more precisely, to a place that no longer exists above ground but whose story is part of the fabric of the city itself. Bugsy Siegel, the man widely credited with building the first major resort casino on the Las Vegas Strip, is buried at Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles. And his death was as dramatic as his life. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel was a gangster, one of the most prominent figures in organized crime during the 1930s and 40s. Born in Brooklyn, he rose through the ranks alongside Meyer Lansky, and by the time he moved to Los Angeles, he was living like a movie star, rubbing elbows with Hollywood celebrities and dating starlets. His grand vision was the Flamingo Hotel, a luxury resort and casino in the Nevada desert that he poured millions of dollars into, much of it belonging to his mob associates. The Flamingo opened in December 1946, and it was initially a disaster. Costs had ballooned far beyond projections, and the mob was losing patience. On the evening of June 20th, 1947, Siegel was sitting in the living room of his girlfriend Virginia Hill's Beverly Hills home, reading the Los Angeles Times. An unknown gunman fired a military carbine through the window, striking Siegel multiple times. He was 41. One of the bullets struck him in the face and exited through his eye, a detail that made for one of the most gruesome crime scene photographs of the era. His murder has never been officially solved, though it is widely believed his mob partners ordered the hit because of the Flamingo's cost overruns. Ironically, the Flamingo eventually became profitable, and it launched the transformation of Las Vegas into the entertainment capital of the world. Siegel's crypt at Hollywood Forever is in the Beth Olam section, a Jewish cemetery within the larger grounds. From one American city that never sleeps to another, Atlanta, Georgia. At the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historical Park, between the Ebenezer Baptist Church where he preached and the home where he was born, rests one of the most important Americans who ever lived. Martin Luther King Jr. needs little introduction for this audience. The Baptist minister from Atlanta became the leader of the American Civil Rights Movement, guiding it with a philosophy of nonviolent resistance inspired by Mahatma Gandhi, a man we'll visit later on this tour. From the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955, which lasted 381 days and desegregated the city's public transit system, to the sit-ins and freedom rides of the early 60s, to the March on Washington in August 1963, where he delivered his legendary "I Have a Dream" speech before 250,000 people on the National Mall, King was the moral compass of a movement that transformed the nation. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 at the age of 35, making him the youngest man to receive the honor at that time. He donated the entire prize money to the civil rights movement. In the years that followed, King expanded his focus to include opposition to the Vietnam War and advocacy for the poor. He was planning a poor people's campaign when he traveled to Memphis in April 1968 to support striking black sanitation workers who were demanding fair wages and better working conditions. On the evening of April 4th, King stepped onto the second-floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel to greet his friends in the parking lot below. Among them was the musician Ben Branch, who was scheduled to perform at a rally that night. King called down to Branch and asked him to play "Take My Hand, Precious Lord," one of his favorite hymns, at the event. Moments later, a single rifle shot struck King in the jaw, severing his spinal cord. He crumpled to the balcony floor. His companions pointed toward the rooming house across the street from which the shot had come. King was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, where he was pronounced dead at 7:05 in the evening. He was 39 years old. James Earl Ray, a small-time criminal and escaped convict, was arrested 2 months later at London's Heathrow Airport, traveling on a false Canadian passport. He pleaded guilty to the assassination and was sentenced to 99 years in prison. He later recanted his guilty plea and spent the rest of his life seeking a trial, claiming he had been set up. He died in prison in 1998. King's assassination triggered riots in more than 100 American cities and deepened the nation's wounds during what was already one of the most turbulent years in its history. 1968 also saw the assassinations of Robert Kennedy, the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, and violent clashes at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Today, King's tomb sits beside a reflecting pool at the National Historical Park in Atlanta, and the site draws more than 1 million visitors each year. The inscription on his tomb echoes the words he spoke at the March on Washington. Free at last, thank God Almighty, I am free at last. Let's lighten the mood just slightly, though not the tragedy, by heading to Moore Memorial Gardens in Arlington, Texas. Here rest two brothers who changed the sound of heavy metal, and one of them was taken in one of the most shocking incidents in the history of live music. We're here for Vinnie Paul and Dimebag Darrell Abbott, the founding members of the legendary band Pantera. Dimebag Darrell was the lead guitarist of Pantera, widely regarded as one of the most influential and technically gifted guitarists in the history of heavy metal. His playing on albums like Cowboys from Hell, Vulgar Display of Power, and Far Beyond Driven defined the groove metal sound and influenced an entire generation of guitarists. When Pantera dissolved in 2003 amid personal tensions between the members, Darrell and his brother Vinnie Paul formed a new band called Damage Plan. On December 8, 2004, the 24th anniversary of John Lennon's murder, as it happens, Damage Plan was performing at a nightclub in Columbus, Ohio. During the opening song, a disturbed former Marine named Nathan Gale rushed the stage and opened fire, shooting Dimebag Darrell multiple times at point-blank range. Gale also killed 3 others before a police officer shot and killed him. Dimebag Darrell was 38. The rock world was devastated. Gene Simmons of Kiss donated a custom Kiss casket for Darrell's burial, and Eddie Van Halen placed his original black and yellow striped Bumblebee guitar in the casket as a final tribute. Vinnie Paul was shattered by his brother's death. He continued to make music, performing with the band Helya, but he never fully recovered. Vinnie Paul died of heart disease in 2018 at the age of 54 and was buried beside his brother here in Arlington. The next stop on our tour requires us to talk about a crime that consumed the nation for more than a year. Let's travel to Ascension Cemetery in Lake Forest, California, where Nicole Brown Simpson is buried. Nicole Brown was just 18 when she met the former football star and actor O.J. Simpson at a Beverly Hills restaurant in 1977. Simpson, a Heisman Trophy winner who had set NFL rushing records with the Buffalo Bills before becoming an actor and television personality, was one of the most famous men in America. They married in 1985 and had 2 children together, but the marriage was troubled from the start. Nicole called police to the couple's Brentwood estate multiple times, and in 1989 Simpson pleaded no contest to a charge of spousal battery. They divorced in 1992. On the night of June 12, 1994, Nicole and her friend Ron Goldman were found stabbed to death outside her condominium on South Bundy Drive in the Brentwood neighborhood of Los Angeles. She was 35, Goldman was 25. Both had been attacked with such ferocity that the scene was almost indescribable. Goldman had come to the condo to return a pair of sunglasses that Nicole's mother had left at the restaurant where he worked as a waiter. He was simply doing a favor. The ensuing investigation quickly focused on O.J. Simpson, and what followed consumed the nation for more than a year. On June 17th, 5 days after the murders, Simpson failed to turn himself in as promised, and instead led police on the now infamous slow-speed chase through the freeways of Los Angeles in a white Ford Bronco driven by his friend Al Cowlings. An estimated 95 million people watched the pursuit live on television. Simpson was eventually arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The trial, which lasted nearly 9 months, was a national obsession. It was broadcast live on television, and the cast of characters — prosecutor Marcia Clark, defense attorney Johnny Cochran, Judge Lance Ito, house guest Kato Kalin, the bloody glove, the DNA evidence — became household names. On October 3, 1995, an estimated 150 million people watched the verdict being read. Simpson was acquitted, in a decision that divided the country largely along racial lines. He was later found liable for both deaths in a 1997 civil trial and ordered to pay over $33 million in damages. Simpson died of cancer in 2024. Nicole Brown Simpson rests at Ascension Cemetery in Lake Forest, California, and Ron Goldman is buried at Valley Oaks Memorial Park in Westlake Village. 2 lives, taken in a moment of terrible violence, and a case that America has never entirely put behind it. From the scene of one of the most publicized crimes of the 1990s, let's journey to the most famous cemetery in the nation's capital. Arlington National Cemetery, with its rolling green hills and rows of identical white headstones, is the final resting place of more than 400,000 veterans and national figures. Among them, near the crest of a gentle hillside, an eternal flame marks the grave of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was riding in an open motorcade through Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas, waving to enthusiastic crowds who had turned out despite a light morning drizzle that had since given way to sunshine. Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie were in the seat directly in front of the Kennedys. Nellie had just turned to the president and said, "Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you," when the shots rang out. Lee Harvey Oswald, a 24-year-old former Marine and self-proclaimed Marxist, was perched on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository overlooking the plaza where he worked as an order filler. He fired 3 shots from an Italian-made Carcano bolt-action rifle. The fatal shot struck Kennedy in the head. Governor Connally was also wounded, struck in the back by a bullet that fractured a rib and punctured his lung, but he survived after hours of surgery. The presidential limousine sped to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where Kennedy was pronounced dead at the age of 46. He had served as president for just over 1,000 days. The assassination of JFK was a defining moment of the 20th century, a loss that an entire generation remembers with vivid clarity. Most people of a certain age can tell you exactly where they were when they heard the news. What they were doing, who told them, how the world suddenly felt different. Vice President Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as president aboard Air Force One at Love Field, with a blood-stained Jacqueline Kennedy standing at his side in a moment captured in one of the most famous photographs of the era. Kennedy's funeral, 3 days later, was watched by hundreds of millions around the world, the riderless horse Black Jack prancing nervously alongside the caisson. The muffled drums, the 21-gun salute, and the image of 3-year-old John Jr. stepping forward and saluting his father's casket, an image that broke hearts around the globe and remains one of the most poignant moments in American memory. Kennedy rests at Arlington alongside his wife Jacqueline, who died in 1994, and 2 of their children who died in infancy. His brothers Robert and Ted are buried nearby. The Eternal Flame, requested by Jackie Kennedy and inspired by the flame at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, has burned continuously since the funeral in 1963. It was briefly extinguished during a renovation in the 1960s but has not gone out since. On any given day, you will find visitors standing quietly before it. Americans, foreign tourists, school children, paying their respects to a president whose youth, charisma, and unfulfilled promise continue to captivate the imagination. Let's now visit a different kind of celebrity, a man who made America laugh for decades. At the Greenwood Memorial Terrace in Thiensville, Wisconsin, a quiet suburb north of Milwaukee, lies Phil Hartman, one of the funniest people ever to grace a television screen. Phil Hartman was a member of the Saturday Night Live cast from 1986 to 1994, and he was so versatile, so reliable, so capable of stepping into any role at a moment's notice that his castmates gave him the ultimate compliment. They called him the Glue, because he held the show together. His impressions were uncanny: Bill Clinton, Frank Sinatra, Ed McMahon, Barbara Bush, Phil Donahue, and dozens of others. But he was equally brilliant at creating original characters. Before SNL, Hartman had been a graphic designer who created album artwork for bands like Poco and America. He was also a member of the Groundlings improv troupe in Los Angeles, where he crossed paths with Paul Reubens. Hartman co-wrote the screenplay for Pee-wee's Big Adventure and helped Reubens develop the Pee-wee Herman character that became a cultural phenomenon. After leaving SNL, Hartman lent his voice to two of the most beloved recurring characters on The Simpsons, the washed-up actor Troy McClure, who greeted audiences with the unforgettable catchphrase, "Hi, I'm Troy McClure. You may remember me from..." and the shady lawyer Lionel Hutz. He also starred as radio host Bill McNeil on the sitcom News Radio, opposite Andy Dick and the late Stephen Root, in a performance that showcased his ability to be both arrogant and lovable at the same time. Behind the scenes, though, Hartman's home life was deeply troubled. His third wife, Bryn Omdahl, struggled with substance abuse and growing resentment of her husband's success. Friends noticed a pattern of erratic behavior and escalating tension between them. In the early morning hours of May 28, 1998, after a dinner party at an Italian restaurant with friends, including Ron Howard and his wife, Bryn returned home and shot Phil twice as he slept in their bed with a .38 caliber revolver. She then drove to the home of a friend, Ron Douglas, and confessed to what she had done. Douglas didn't believe her at first, but when he accompanied her back to the Hartman home, he found Phil's body. While Douglas called 911, Bryn went into the bedroom and took her own life with the same gun. Phil Hartman was 49. Their two children, Sean and Bergen, were asleep in the house during both shootings and were physically unharmed. His death was a devastating blow to the comedy world. John Lovitz, his closest friend and fellow SNL alumnus, was so grief-stricken that for years he could barely speak about Hartman without tears. The Simpsons retired both of Hartman's characters permanently. They simply never appeared again, a gesture that spoke to how irreplaceable he was. News Radio continued for one final season, with Lovitz joining the cast in a role that was, by all accounts, one of the most emotionally difficult jobs in television. Phil Hartman's talent, warmth, and professionalism are still spoken of with reverence by virtually everyone who worked with him. From the world of comedy, let us cross into the world of hip-hop, a genre that has lost far too many of its brightest stars to violence. In a private mausoleum at an undisclosed location in New Jersey rests Christopher Wallace, known to the world as the Notorious B.I.G, or simply Biggie Smalls. He was one of the greatest rappers who ever lived, and he was murdered at the peak of his powers. Born and raised in the Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood of Brooklyn, Biggie was a high school dropout who had been dealing drugs on the streets of Clinton Hill before his freestyle skills caught the attention of a music industry insider. A demo tape made its way to the Source magazine, and a brief feature in their unsigned hype column caught the ear of Sean Puffy Combs, then an up-and-coming producer at Uptown Records. Combs signed him immediately, and when Combs launched his own label, Bad Boy Records, Biggie became its cornerstone artist. His 1994 debut album Ready to Die was a masterpiece, a record that blended gritty street narratives with a storytelling ability that was nothing short of literary. No rapper before him had painted scenes with such vivid detail or such emotional range. Tracks like Juicy, in which he reminisced about his rise from poverty, and Big Papa, a smooth, champagne-soaked party anthem, showed a versatility that set him apart from his contemporaries. His deep, rumbling voice, his effortless flow, and his gift for punchlines made him the undisputed king of East Coast rap almost overnight. By 1997, he was embroiled in a bitter and very public feud between East Coast and West Coast hip-hop, a rivalry that pitted Bad Boy Records against Death Row Records and Biggie against his former friend Tupac Shakur, whom we'll visit shortly. The feud was stoked by media coverage and record label posturing, and it escalated from lyrical jabs to genuine danger. Tupac had been murdered in Las Vegas just 6 months earlier, and the hip-hop world was on edge. On March 9, 1997, Biggie was in Los Angeles to promote his upcoming second album and to present an award at the Soul Train Music Awards. After the ceremony, he attended a music industry party at the Peterson Automotive Museum. When the party let out, a crowd gathered on the sidewalk. Biggie climbed into the passenger seat of a GMC Suburban, and the vehicle inched its way into traffic on Wilshire Boulevard. At a red light, a dark-colored Chevrolet Impala pulled up alongside the SUV. The driver rolled down the window and opened fire with a 9mm pistol. 4 bullets struck Biggie in the chest and abdomen. His entourage sped to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, but he was pronounced dead on arrival. He was 24 years old. His second album, Life After Death, was released just 16 days later and debuted at number 1 on the Billboard 200. It is now considered one of the greatest hip-hop albums ever recorded, a sprawling double disc that showcased Biggie's range as a storyteller, a humorist, and a philosopher of the streets. His murder remains officially unsolved more than a quarter century later, though investigators have pursued numerous leads, and the case has been the subject of countless documentaries and investigative reports. The loss of both Tupac and Biggie within 6 months of each other, 2 of the most gifted lyricists the genre had ever produced, marked the end of an era in hip-hop and a sobering reminder of how real the violence had become. Speaking of lives, cut short at the moment of their brightest promise, let's make our way to Willamette National Cemetery in Portland, Oregon. Here lies a young woman whose story became the subject of an acclaimed film and a cautionary tale about the dark side of fame. Dorothy Stratten was just 20 when she was murdered. Stratten was a Canadian model who was discovered working at a Dairy Queen in Vancouver by a small-time promoter named Paul Snyder. He became her manager and, eventually, her husband. Under his guidance, she was named Playboy's Playmate of the Year in 1980, and her acting career was beginning to blossom. She had appeared in films like Skate Town, USA, and had a leading role in Peter Bogdanovich's They All Laughed. Bogdanovich and Stratten had begun a romantic relationship, and she was pulling away from Snyder, who grew increasingly possessive and violent. On August 14, 1980, Snyder lured Stratten to the home they had once shared in Los Angeles, where he sexually assaulted her and killed her with a shotgun before turning the weapon on himself. Her death inspired 2 films, Star 80, directed by Bob Fosse, and Death of a Centerfold, a television movie, and Bogdanovich's memoir, The Killing of the Unicorn. Dorothy Stratten's story is a reminder of how quickly promise can be extinguished by jealousy and rage. Our next stop is a place of profound significance in American history, Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, about 40 minutes north of Manhattan. Among its many notable residents, one man's presence here carries the weight of a movement. This is where Malcolm X rests. Born Malcolm Little in Omaha, Nebraska, in 1925, the man who would become Malcolm X endured a childhood marked by racial violence. His father, a Baptist preacher and follower of Marcus Garvey, was killed under suspicious circumstances when Malcolm was 6, and the family was harassed by white supremacist groups. His mother was eventually committed to a mental institution, and Malcolm was sent to foster care. He drifted into a life of crime in Boston and Harlem, and it was in prison, serving a sentence for burglary, that he was introduced to the Nation of Islam and its leader, Elijah Muhammad. The transformation was profound. He educated himself voraciously, reading everything he could find in the prison library, and he adopted the surname X to symbolize the African family name he could never know, lost to the slave trade. Upon his release, Malcolm quickly became the Nation of Islam's most eloquent and visible spokesperson, advocating for black self-determination, self-defense, and separation from white society with an intensity and intellectual force that both inspired and unsettled white America. Where Martin Luther King Jr. preached integration and nonviolence, Malcolm X argued that black Americans had every right to defend themselves by any means necessary. The two men were often portrayed as opposites, though in reality their views were more nuanced than the media suggested, and they shared a deep commitment to the dignity and liberation of black people. Malcolm's philosophy evolved significantly over the course of his life, particularly after his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1964, where he prayed alongside Muslims of all races and came to believe that true brotherhood was possible across color lines. This spiritual awakening led him to break with the Nation of Islam and its leader, a rupture that was deepened by Malcolm's discovery that Elijah Muhammad had fathered several children with young secretaries in the organization. The break made him a target. He received death threats and his home was firebombed. He told friends he did not expect to live much longer. On February 21, 1965, Malcolm X was preparing to speak at the Audubon Ballroom in Washington Heights, Manhattan, when a disturbance broke out in the audience. As Malcolm's security guards moved toward the commotion, several men rushed the stage. One fired a sawed-off shotgun into Malcolm's chest. Two others shot him with handguns. He was struck 21 times. He was 39 years old. 3 members of the Nation of Islam were convicted of his murder, though the case has been mired in controversy for decades. In 2021, 2 of those convictions were vacated after a joint investigation by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office and the Innocence Project found that prosecutors and the FBI had withheld evidence that could have changed the outcome of the trial. Only one of the 3 original defendants is now considered to have actually participated in the shooting. Malcolm X's autobiography, written with Alex Haley and published shortly after his death, remains one of the most important and widely read books of the 20th century. His influence on the Black Power movement, on hip-hop culture, and on subsequent generations of activists and thinkers is immeasurable. Let us pause from the weight of history and turn our attention to music once more. At Forest Lawn Memorial Park in the Hollywood Hills section of Los Angeles, a different forest lawn from the one where we visited Sam Cooke, there is a private crypt that holds the remains of one of the most gifted voices in the history of popular music. Marvin Gaye rests here, and his death is among the most painful in all of music because of who pulled the trigger. Marvin Gaye was the Prince of Motown, a singer whose smooth tenor and emotional depth transformed rhythm and blues. He started out singing in his father's church, and after a stint in the Air Force, he found his way to Detroit and the fledgling Motown Records label. His early hits, How Sweet It Is to Be Loved by You, Ain't That Peculiar, and the chart-topping I Heard It Through the Grapevine, established him as one of the most popular male vocalists in America. His duets with Tammy Terrell, including Ain't No Mountain High Enough and You're All I Need to Get By, are among the most beloved recordings in the Motown catalog. When Terrell collapsed into his arms on stage in 1967, she had a brain tumor that would claim her life at 24, Gaye was so devastated that he briefly retreated from performing. But his greatest artistic achievement was yet to come. In 1971, inspired by the political and social turmoil of the era and motivated in part by conversations with Ronaldo Obi Benson of the Four Tops, Gaye recorded What's Going On, a concept album that addressed poverty, war, and environmental destruction. Motown founder Berry Gordy initially refused to release it, telling Gaye it was the worst thing he'd ever heard. Gaye insisted, and the album became a massive critical and commercial success, eventually recognized as one of the greatest albums ever made. He reinvented himself again with the sensual masterpiece Let's Get It On in 1973 and the disco-influenced Got to Give It Up in 1977. His 1982 comeback, Sexual Healing, won him 2 Grammy Awards and proved he could still command the charts. But behind the music, Gaye was a man in pain. He struggled with depression, cocaine addiction, and a deeply troubled relationship with his father, Marvin Gaye Sr. The family originally spelled the name without the E. which Marvin added partly to distance himself from his father, and partly to dispel rumors about his sexuality. The elder Gaye was a strict Pentecostal minister who was known to be physically abusive to his children. The tension between father and son had been building for decades. On April 1, 1984, the day before Marvin's 45th birthday, the two men got into a heated argument at the family home in the West Adams district of Los Angeles. The fight reportedly started over a misplaced insurance document. Marvin Gaye Sr. retrieved a .38 caliber handgun, a weapon that, in a painful irony, his son had given him months earlier for protection, and shot Marvin twice. The first bullet struck him in the right side of his chest. The second was fired at close range as he lay on the floor. Marvin Gaye was pronounced dead at California Hospital Medical Center shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon. His father pleaded no contest to a reduced charge of voluntary manslaughter after doctors discovered a walnut-sized brain tumor that may have affected his behavior and judgment. He received a 5-year suspended sentence and probation. He died in 1998. Marvin Gaye was posthumously inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1987, and his music remains as vital and relevant today as it was when he first sang it. From the world of soul music to the world of high fashion, a world that might seem immune to the kind of violence we've been discussing, but is not. Gianni Versace, one of the most celebrated fashion designers of the 20th century, was murdered on the steps of his own home on July 15, 1997. His ashes were returned to Italy and placed in the family vault at Moltrasio Cemetery, a quiet and beautiful spot overlooking Lake Como. Versace had built a global fashion empire known for its bold colors, daring prints, and unabashedly sensual designs. He dressed some of the most famous women in the world, from Princess Diana to Madonna, and he is credited with helping to launch the supermodel phenomenon of the 1990s. He was also known for his warm personality and his love of entertaining. His Miami Beach mansion, Casa Casuarina, was a gathering place for celebrities and artists from around the world. On that July morning, Versace returned from a walk to a nearby cafe, as was his daily habit. As he climbed the front steps and reached for his keys, a 27-year-old man named Andrew Cunanan approached from behind and shot him twice in the back of the head. Versace was 50 years old. Cunanan was a serial killer who had already murdered 4 other men during a cross-country spree that spring. 8 days after killing Versace, Cunanan was found dead on a houseboat in Miami Beach, having taken his own life. His motive for targeting Versace has never been conclusively established. Approximately 2,000 people attended Versace's memorial service at the Milan Cathedral, including Princess Diana, Elton John, Naomi Campbell, and Giorgio Armani. Just 6 weeks later, Princess Diana herself would be gone, though her death, of course, was not a murder. From the glamour of the fashion world, let us travel to one of the most somber sites on our entire tour. At the Burr Oak Cemetery in Alsip, Illinois, a southern suburb of Chicago, lies Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy whose murder in 1955 became a turning point in the American Civil Rights Movement. In August of that year, young Emmett, a lively, outgoing boy who loved baseball and practical jokes, traveled from his home on the south side of Chicago to visit relatives in the Mississippi Delta town of Money. It was a world away from Chicago, a place where the racial hierarchy was enforced with casual brutality. Before he left, his mother Mamie warned him about how different things were in the Deep South, told him to be careful, to mind his manners, to say "yes, sir" and "no, ma'am." On August 24th, Emmett and some cousins went to Bryant's Grocery and Meat Market. What happened inside the store has been disputed for decades. The prevailing account at the time was that Emmett whistled at Carolyn Bryant, a 21-year-old white woman behind the counter. Decades later, Carolyn Bryant recanted key parts of her testimony, admitting that Emmett had never grabbed her or made verbal threats. Whatever the provocation, and by any standard it was trivial, the response was savage beyond comprehension. Several days later, in the early morning hours of August 28th, Carolyn's husband Roy Bryant and his half-brother J.W. Milam drove to the home of Emmett's great-uncle, Moses Wright. They demanded the boy be brought out. Wright pleaded with them not to take him. They took him anyway, forcing the terrified 14-year-old into the back of their truck. What followed was hours of torture. They beat Emmett mercilessly, gouged out one of his eyes, shot him in the head with a .45 caliber pistol, and then dumped his body in the Tallahatchie River with a 75-pound cotton gin fan tied to his neck with barbed wire. When Emmett's body was recovered 3 days later, it was so badly disfigured that he could only be identified by a signet ring he wore that had belonged to his father. What his mother did next changed American history. Mamie Till Mobley insisted on an open-casket funeral in Chicago so that the world could see, in her words, what they did to my baby. Tens of thousands of mourners filed past the casket at Robert's Temple Church of God in Christ, and photographs of Emmett's battered face, published in Jet magazine and the Chicago Defender, shocked the conscience of the nation. For many white Americans who had been able to ignore the horrors of racial violence in the South, those photographs made ignorance impossible. Bryant and Milam were tried for murder in a courthouse in Sumner, Mississippi. Moses Wright, despite the mortal danger of doing so, stood up in the courtroom, pointed at the defendants, and identified them as the men who took Emmett from his home, an act of almost unimaginable courage for a black man in Mississippi in 1955. The all-white jury deliberated for just 67 minutes before returning a verdict of not guilty. One juror later said it wouldn't have taken that long if they hadn't paused for a soda. Months later, protected by double jeopardy, Bryant and Milam confessed to the killing in a paid interview with Look magazine, openly describing what they had done. Neither spent a day in prison for Emmett's murder. Emmett Till's murder and the bravery of his mother are widely credited with helping to ignite the modern civil rights movement. Rosa Parks later said that she thought of Emmett Till when she refused to give up her seat on that Montgomery bus just 100 days after his murder. After the weight of that story, let us travel to a quieter corner of grief. At Westwood Village Memorial Park in Los Angeles, one of the smallest but most star-studded cemeteries in the world, lies Rebecca Schaeffer, a young actress whose murder at the age of 21 led to one of the most important pieces of anti-stalking legislation in American history. Rebecca Schaeffer was a rising star in Hollywood. She was best known for co-starring as Patty Russell alongside Pam Dauber in the CBS sitcom My Sister Sam, which ran from 1986 to 1988. She had also appeared in a few films and was beginning to land bigger roles. On the morning of July 18, 1989, a man named Robert John Bardo rang the doorbell of her West Hollywood apartment. Bardo was an obsessed fan who had been writing letters to Schaeffer for years. When she opened the door, he shot her once in the chest at point-blank range. She died within minutes. Bardo had obtained Schaeffer's home address by hiring a private investigator who pulled the information from California Department of Motor Vehicles records. In the wake of her murder, California passed the nation's first anti-stalking law in 1990, and the state also restricted public access to DMV records. Bardo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rebecca Schaeffer rests at Westwood in the company of other entertainment luminaries, including Marilyn Monroe, Dean Martin, and Natalie Wood. We mentioned Tupac Shakur a bit earlier in connection with the Notorious B.I.G. Now it's time to tell his own story. Tupac's resting place is an unusual one. He was cremated after his death, and his ashes were divided among family and friends. His mother, Afeni Shakur, reportedly scattered some of his ashes off the coast of Malibu and kept the remainder. Eventually, according to recent accounts, some of his ashes were buried on the grounds of a property his mother built in Lumberton, North Carolina. Tupac Amaru Shakur was more than a rapper. He was a poet, an actor, and a cultural force whose influence has only grown in the decades since his death. Born in East Harlem in 1971, he was named after Tupac Amaru II, the 18th century Peruvian revolutionary. His mother, Afeni Shakur, was a member of the Black Panther Party who had been acquitted of bombing charges while pregnant with Tupac. He grew up surrounded by political activism and hardship in equal measure, moving between New York, Baltimore, and the Bay Area. At the Baltimore School for the Performing Arts, he studied acting and ballet, and his early artistic instincts were as much theatrical as musical. By the time he was 20, he had released his first solo album, Tupacalypse Now, a raw and politically charged record that drew both praise from critics and condemnation from Vice President Dan Quayle for its unflinching depictions of urban life. His subsequent albums, Strictly for My Niggas, Me Against the World, and the monumental double album All Eyes on Me, which went diamond, established him as the most compelling voice of his generation. He could be tender and introspective one moment, fierce and defiant the next. He appeared in films like Juice, Poetic Justice, opposite Janet Jackson, and Above the Rim, showing genuine acting ability that suggested he could have had a significant screen career. But Tupac's life was shadowed by violence, legal troubles, and a combustible personality that made him as many enemies as friends. In November 1994, he was shot 5 times during a robbery in the lobby of a New York recording studio, and he survived. He later accused Sean Puffy Combs and the Notorious B.I.G. of having knowledge of the attack, a charge both men denied. The accusation ignited the East Coast-West Coast feud that dominated hip-hop headlines for the next 2 years and contributed to a climate of real danger. On the night of September 7, 1996, Tupac attended the Mike Tyson vs. Bruce Seldon boxing match at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. After the fight, Tupac and members of his entourage got into a physical altercation in the hotel lobby with a man named Orlando Anderson, who was affiliated with the Southside Crips. Later that evening, while riding in the passenger seat of a black BMW driven by Death Row Records founder Suge Knight, Tupac's car stopped at a red light on Flamingo Road near the Las Vegas Strip. A white Cadillac pulled up alongside them, and the occupants opened fire with a .40 caliber Glock pistol. Tupac was struck by 4 bullets, 2 in the chest, 1 in the arm, and 1 in the thigh. Knight was grazed in the head by a fragment. Tupac was rushed to University Medical Center, where he underwent multiple surgeries. He fought for his life for 6 agonizing days before dying on September 13, 1996. He was 25 years old. In 2023, more than a quarter century after the murder, Dwayne "Keffy" D. Davis, an ex-gang leader and uncle of Orlando Anderson, was arrested and charged with orchestrating the killing. He had implicated himself in media interviews and a memoir over the years. He pleaded not guilty to first-degree murder, and the case remains ongoing. Tupac's body was cremated, and his ashes were divided among family and close friends. His mother, Afeni, reportedly scattered some off the coast of Malibu and eventually buried some on a property she built in Lumberton, North Carolina. More than a quarter century after his death, Tupac Shakur remains one of the best-selling and most influential artists in the history of hip-hop, and his music, angry, tender, prophetic, and deeply human, continues to speak to new generations who never knew him alive. From the world of hip-hop to the world of Hollywood once more. At Westwood Village Memorial Park, the same small cemetery where we visited Rebecca Schaeffer, there is another young actress whose murder at the age of 22 devastated those who knew her. Her name was Dominique Dunne. If that last name sounds familiar, it should. Dominique was the daughter of writer and Vanity Fair journalist Dominique Dunne and the sister of actor Griffin Dunne. She had appeared in several television shows, but her most famous role was as Dana Freeling, the older sister in Steven Spielberg's blockbuster 1982 film Poltergeist. She was beautiful, talented, and just beginning to build a career that many believed would rival her family's considerable achievements. On October 30, 1982, just months after Poltergeist was released, Dominique's ex-boyfriend, a sous chef named John Sweeney, came to the home she shared with a roommate. He argued with Dominique in the driveway, then strangled her until she fell unconscious. She never regained consciousness and was taken off life support on November 4th. In a verdict that outraged her family and much of the public, Sweeney was convicted only of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 6.5 years in prison. He served less than 4 years. Her father, Dominic, devastated by both the murder and the lenient sentence, channeled his grief into a career as a crime writer, covering high-profile trials for Vanity Fair, including the O.J. Simpson case. Dominique rests at Westwood alongside her father, who died in 2009. Two members of the Kennedy family have already appeared on our tour: President Kennedy and, tangentially, his brother Ted. Now it's time for the third Kennedy to fall to an assassin's bullet. Robert Francis Kennedy is buried at Arlington National Cemetery, just a short distance from his brother's eternal flame. Bobby Kennedy was many things: a former attorney general under his brother's administration, a United States senator from New York, and in 1968, a leading candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination. As Attorney General, he had waged war on organized crime and become a fierce advocate for civil rights. As a senator, he championed the cause of the poor and marginalized, visiting Appalachian coal towns and migrant worker camps with a sincerity that was uncommon in American politics. His 1968 presidential campaign was fueled by opposition to the Vietnam War and a deep commitment to racial and economic justice. He drew enormous crowds everywhere he went, particularly among young people and minority communities. On the night of June 5, 1968, after winning the California Democratic primary, a critical victory that put him on a path toward the nomination, Kennedy addressed his jubilant supporters in the ballroom of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles. "Now it's on to Chicago," he said, referring to the upcoming Democratic convention, "and let's win there." He finished his speech, and rather than exiting through the ballroom, was directed through the hotel kitchen, a shortcut to the press room. As he passed through the narrow pantry area, shaking hands with kitchen workers, a 24-year-old Palestinian immigrant named Sirhan Bishara Sirhan stepped forward from behind a tray stacker and fired a .22 caliber Iver Johnson revolver at close range. Kennedy was struck 3 times, once behind the right ear and twice in the back. 5 bystanders were also wounded. In the chaos that followed, the writer George Plimpton and the former decathlete Rafer Johnson wrestled Sirhan to a steam table and disarmed him. Kennedy lay on the concrete floor, his eyes open, a rosary pressed into his hand by a busboy named Juan Romero, who had been shaking his hand when the shots were fired. Kennedy was rushed to Good Samaritan Hospital, where surgeons operated for nearly 4 hours, but the damage was too severe. Robert Francis Kennedy died the following day, June 6, 1968. He was 42 years old. His assassination came just 2 months after the murder of Martin Luther King Jr., plunging the nation into a period of almost unbearable despair. Sirhan was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, which was later commuted to life in prison when California briefly abolished the death penalty. He has been denied parole more than a dozen times. Bobby Kennedy's funeral mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York was attended by over 2,000 mourners, and his body was transported by a special funeral train from New York to Washington, a journey of more than 200 miles, during which hundreds of thousands of people lined the tracks to pay their respects, many of them weeping, many holding hand-lettered signs, many simply standing at attention. He was buried at Arlington by the light of candles, just a hillside away from his brother. After that solemn journey, let's step into a world that might seem a far cry from the Kennedys, but which involves a murder every bit as shocking in its own community. At Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Goodlettsville, Tennessee, a suburb of Nashville, lies David Stringbean Aikman, one of country music's most beloved entertainers. Stringbean was a banjo player and comedian who was a regular on the Grand Ole Opry for more than 2 decades and a cast member of the television show Hee Haw. Tall and rail-thin, he was famous for his comic stage persona, wearing a long nightshirt and hitching his belt far below his waist to exaggerate his already lanky frame. He was a gifted musician too, known for his distinctive 3-finger banjo-picking style. On the night of November 10, 1973, Stringbean and his wife Estelle returned home from performing at the Grand Ole Opry to find their cabin near Nashville had been broken into. 2 cousins named John and Marvin Brown had ransacked the place looking for money. It was widely rumored in Nashville that String Bean didn't trust banks and kept large sums of cash hidden in his home and sewn into his clothing. The Browns ambushed the couple. String Bean was shot on the front porch, and Estelle was killed just inside the doorway. They were discovered the following morning by their neighbor and fellow Opry star, Grandpa Jones. Both Browns were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. As for the rumored cash, the Browns found very little in the cabin. Years later, when the property was being renovated, workers reportedly discovered a substantial amount of money hidden behind a fireplace brick. String Bean had been right not to trust banks, but his caution may have cost him his life. He was 58 years old. From the hills of Tennessee, let us return to Southern California and a story that belongs to the strange intersection of Hollywood and true crime. At Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills, not far from Marvin Gaye's resting place, lies Lana Clarkson, an actress whose name became known to most people only because of the famous man who killed her. Lana Clarkson was a tall, striking actress who appeared in a string of B-movies in the 1980s and 90s, including Barbarian Queen and Deathstalker, as well as small roles in bigger productions like Scarface and Fast Times at Ridgemont High. By 2003, at the age of 40, she was working as a hostess at the House of Blues in West Hollywood. On the night of February 3rd, she met legendary music producer Phil Spector at the club, and he invited her back to his mansion in Alhambra. In the early morning hours, she was found dead in the foyer of Spector's home, shot once in the mouth. Spector claimed she had shot herself, but the physical evidence and testimony painted a different picture. Spector's first trial ended in a mistrial in 2007. At a second trial in 2009, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 19 years to life. Spector, who had produced some of the most iconic recordings in music history, including records for the Ronettes, the Righteous Brothers, and the Beatles, died in prison in 2021 at the age of 81. Lana Clarkson deserved better than to be remembered primarily as Phil Spector's victim, but her death shone a spotlight on the violent impulses that had apparently been part of Spector's character for decades. Now we head to a neighborhood in South Los Angeles that has been transformed in recent years, in large part because of the man we're about to visit. Nipsey Hussle, the Grammy-nominated rapper and community activist, is buried at Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills. His murder in 2019 was a gut-wrenching loss for the city of Los Angeles and the hip-hop community at large. Born Ermias Joseph Asghedom, Nipsey Hussle grew up in the Crenshaw neighborhood and was open about his past involvement with the Rollin' 60s Crips. But as he matured, he channeled his energy into music and, more importantly, into rebuilding his community. He opened a clothing store called the Marathon Clothing on the corner of Crenshaw and Slauson, and he invested in STEM education programs, affordable housing, and small businesses in the area. His 2018 album Victory Lap was nominated for a Grammy Award for Best Rap Album. On March 31, 2019, Nipsey was standing in the parking lot outside his clothing store when a man named Eric Holder, an acquaintance, approached and shot him multiple times. Nipsey was 33 years old. Holder was convicted of first-degree murder in 2022 and sentenced to 60 years to life in prison. Nipsey's funeral was held at the Staples Center and was attended by over 20,000 mourners. His legacy as a community builder may ultimately prove even more enduring than his music. From the streets of South Los Angeles to the wide-open ranges of Texas, at the Texas State Cemetery in Austin, a pathway lined with Texas flags leads to the grave of Chris Kyle, the deadliest sniper in United States military history, whose life and death became the subject of a blockbuster film. Kyle was a Navy SEAL who served 4 tours in the Iraq War, during which he recorded more than 150 confirmed kills, earning the nickname The Legend among his fellow service members. He was awarded numerous honors, including the Silver Star and the Bronze Star. After leaving the military, Kyle dedicated himself to helping fellow veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress. In 2012, he published a best-selling memoir called American Sniper, which was adapted into a 2014 film directed by Clint Eastwood and starring Bradley Cooper. Tragically, Kyle did not live to see the film's release. On February 2, 2013, he and a friend took a 25-year-old Marine veteran named Eddie Ray Routh to a shooting range in Glen Rose, Texas, as part of an effort to help Routh cope with his PTSD. Routh turned his weapon on Kyle and his friend, killing them both. Kyle was 38. Routh was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The cruel irony of Chris Kyle's death, killed while trying to help a fellow veteran heal, has stayed with many Americans who see him as a symbol of both the bravery and the lasting costs of war. From a modern military hero, let's reach far back to one of the most beloved child stars of the golden age of Hollywood. At Valhalla Memorial Park in North Hollywood rests Carl "Alfalfa" Switzer, the freckle-faced, cowlick sporting kid from the Our Gang comedies, also known as the Little Rascals. If you grew up watching those shorts, you know Alfalfa. He was the romantic one, the kid who was always trying to impress Darla Hood with his off-key singing. Switzer appeared in more than 60 Our Gang films between 1935 and 1940, and he became one of the most recognizable child actors in American history. But as with many child stars, adult life was not kind to Carl Switzer. He struggled to find steady work in Hollywood, taking small parts in B-movies and working odd jobs, including as a hunting guide. On January 21, 1959, Switzer went to the home of a man named Moses Bud Stilts to collect a $50 debt. An argument ensued, and Stilts shot Switzer in the groin. The bullet severed a major artery, and Switzer died at the age of 31. Stilts claimed self-defense and was never charged. Some who knew Switzer disputed the self-defense claim, but the case was closed. It was a sad, almost sordid end for a kid who once made millions of people smile. Another actor whose life ended in violence, and whose murder also went unsolved for decades, is Sal Mineo. He is buried at Gate of Heaven Cemetery in Hawthorne, New York, not far from where he grew up in the Bronx. Sal Mineo was a gifted young actor who burst onto the scene in the 1950s with a string of memorable performances. He received his first Academy Award nomination at the age of 16 for his role as John Plato Crawford in the James Dean classic Rebel Without a Cause. He earned a second Oscar nomination for his role in Exodus, opposite Paul Newman. In between, he had a successful recording career with the hit single Start Movin', reaching the top 10. But by the late 1960s, his career had slowed. On the night of February 12, 1976, Mineo was returning home from a rehearsal in West Hollywood when he was stabbed in the chest in the carport of his apartment building. He cried out for help, but died before paramedics could save him. He was 37. The case went unsolved for nearly 3 years, until a pizza delivery man named Lionel Ray Williams was arrested for the crime. Williams was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 51 years to life. The killing was apparently a random robbery gone wrong. Williams did not even know his victim was a famous actor. From one young talent taken too soon to another. At Berlin Memorial Gardens in Berlin, New Jersey, lies Christina Grimmie, a singer and songwriter who was just 22 when she was killed while doing what she loved most, connecting with her fans. Christina Grimmie first gained attention through her YouTube channel, where she posted cover songs and original music that accumulated millions of views. In 2014, she competed on Season 6 of NBC's The Voice, finishing in third place as a member of Team Adam Levine. She was known for her powerful vocal range and her warm, approachable personality. On the night of June 10, 2016, Grimmie had just finished performing a concert at the Plaza Live venue in Orlando, Florida. She was greeting fans and signing autographs in the lobby when a 27-year-old man named Kevin James Loibl walked up to her and shot her. Her brother Marcus immediately tackled Loibl, who then turned the gun on himself. Grimmie died at a nearby hospital. Loibl had never met her. He was an obsessed fan who had traveled from his home in St. Petersburg, Florida, with 2 handguns and a hunting knife. The shooting occurred just 2 days before the Pulse nightclub massacre, also in Orlando, and both events cast a long shadow over the city that summer. Christina Grimmie's death was a devastating loss for her family, her fans, and the music community. Speaking of crimes that took place in the wake of other tragedies, Let us take a brief and unusual detour. At Shannon Rose Hill Memorial Park in Fort Worth, Texas, under a simple marker bearing only his last name, lies Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who assassinated President Kennedy. He is not here because he was a celebrity in any traditional sense, but because he too was murdered, shot dead on live national television just 2 days after the assassination. On November 24, 1963, as Oswald was being transferred from the Dallas City Jail to the county jail, a local nightclub owner named Jack Ruby stepped forward from a crowd of reporters in the basement of the police station and shot Oswald once in the abdomen. Oswald died at Parkland Memorial Hospital, the same hospital where Kennedy had been pronounced dead 2 days earlier. It was the first murder ever broadcast live on American television. Ruby claimed he killed Oswald to spare Jacqueline Kennedy the ordeal of a trial, but many have speculated that there were darker motives. Ruby was convicted of murder and sentenced to death, but the conviction was overturned on appeal. He died of lung cancer while awaiting a new trial in 1967. Oswald's burial was attended by very few people. Most cemeteries in the area had refused to accept his body. His original headstone bore his full name, but it was stolen. It was replaced with the simpler marker that exists today. From one of the most infamous names in American crime to a musical legend cut down in the prime of his career, Jason Mizell, known to the world as Jam Master Jay, was the pioneering DJ of the groundbreaking hip-hop group Run DMC. He is buried at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, the same cemetery where Malcolm X rests. Run DMC didn't just make hip-hop music, they made hip-hop mainstream. Their 1986 collaboration with Aerosmith on Walk This Way broke down the wall between rock and rap and opened the door for hip-hop to become the dominant musical force it is today. Jay's turntable skills were the engine behind hits like It's Tricky, King of Rock, and My Adidas. On October 30, 2002, Jay was shot in the head at his recording studio in Jamaica, Queens. He was 37. The case went cold for nearly 2 decades before 2 men, Carl Jordan Jr. and Ronald Washington, were finally charged with his murder in 2020. In 2024, Jordan was convicted of murder. His trial revealed that the killing was related to a drug deal gone wrong. Washington died before he could be tried. The conviction, more than 20 years in the making, provided a measure of justice for Jay's family, though the long wait was agonizing. Let's step back to old Hollywood now, way back to the silent film era. At Calvary Cemetery in East Los Angeles lies Ramon Novarro, one of the biggest stars of the silent screen and early talkies, a man who was once promoted as a rival to Rudolph Valentino. Born in Durango, Mexico, Ramon Novarro came to Los Angeles as a teenager and worked his way into the film industry. His breakthrough role was as the lead in the 1925 epic Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, the same story that would later be remade with Charlton Heston. Novarro was handsome, talented, and enormously popular, and he was one of the first Mexican-born actors to achieve major stardom in Hollywood. As sound arrived and the studio system changed, his career faded, though he continued to work in television through the 1960s. On the night of October 30th, 1968, 2 brothers named Paul and Tom Ferguson went to Novarro's home in the Hollywood Hills. They had heard a rumor that the aging actor kept a large sum of cash in his house. They beat and tortured the 69-year-old man for hours before he died of asphyxiation. The brothers were convicted of first-degree murder. The cash they were looking for, reportedly $5,000 that Valentino had once given Novarro as a gift, was never found. From one act of senseless violence in a Hollywood home to another, but this one separated by nearly a century. At Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, one of New York's grandest and most historic cemeteries, lies Adrienne Shelly, a filmmaker and actress whose murder in 2006 robbed the world of a remarkable talent. Adrienne Shelly first gained attention as an actress in Hal Hartley's independent films The Unbelievable Truth and Trust in the early 1990s. But her true passion was writing and directing, and she had just completed what would become her masterpiece, the 2007 film Waitress, a warm-hearted comedy drama that she wrote, directed, and starred in alongside Kerry Russell and Nathan Fillion. On November 1st, 2006, before the film had been released, Shelly was found dead in her Greenwich Village apartment, hanging from a shower rod. Initially, it was thought she had taken her own life. But investigators soon discovered that a 19-year-old construction worker named Diego Pilco, who had been doing work in her building, had killed her during a confrontation about noise. He staged the scene to look like something it wasn't. Pilco was convicted of first-degree manslaughter and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Waitress was released posthumously to critical acclaim and later became a hit Broadway musical. Shelley's husband established the Adrienne Shelly Foundation in her memory, which provides grants and scholarships to women in the film industry. She was 40 years old. Remaining in the silent film era for a moment, let's discuss one of Hollywood's oldest unsolved mysteries. At Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles, the director William Desmond Taylor is buried, and his death in 1922 generated one of the first great Hollywood scandals. Taylor was a successful and well-respected director of silent films, having helmed nearly 60 productions. On the morning of February 2, 1922, his valet found him dead in his bungalow in the Westlake neighborhood, with a single gunshot wound to his back. The investigation was immediately compromised. Studio executives reportedly removed personal items from the bungalow before police arrived, fearing a scandal. Suspicion fell on several people, including the actress Mabel Normand, who had visited Taylor the night before, and the actress Mary Miles Minter, who was rumored to have had an affair with the director. The case was never solved, and it remains one of Hollywood's most enduring mysteries more than a century later. Taylor was 49 at the time of his death. From the distant past to the very recent present. In June 2018, 20-year-old rapper XXXTentacion, born Jesse Onfroy, was shot and killed in Deerfield Beach, Florida. He is buried at Gardens of Boca Raton Memorial Park in Boca Raton, Florida. XXXTentacion was a polarizing figure in modern hip-hop. His music was raw, emotional, and genre-defying, blending elements of hip-hop, rock, and emo in a way that resonated with millions of young fans. His album 17, released in 2017, debuted at number 2 on the Billboard 200 and dealt candidly with themes of depression and loneliness. His follow-up, A Question Mark, debuted at number 1. But his personal life was shadowed by serious allegations of domestic violence and assault. On June 18, 2018, XXXTentacion was leaving Riva Motorsports, a motorcycle dealership, when a dark-colored SUV blocked his vehicle. 2 armed men approached and shot him during what appeared to be a robbery. He was 20 years old. 4 men were eventually arrested and charged with his murder. In 2024, 3 of them pleaded guilty to lesser charges. The 4th went to trial and was convicted of first-degree murder. Despite the controversies surrounding his life, XXXTentacion's music has continued to resonate. His posthumous album Skins debuted at number 1, making him one of the rare artists to achieve that feat after death. Now let's visit what might be the most famous unsolved murder in American history. At Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, California, though her original burial was in Los Angeles, the remains of Elizabeth Short are interred. You probably know her by another name, the Black Dahlia. On January 15, 1947, the body of a 22-year-old aspiring actress was found in a vacant lot in the Leimert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. The body had been bisected at the waist, drained of blood, and posed deliberately. The mutilation was so extreme and the case so sensational that it became an instant media frenzy. Reporters gave Short the nickname the Black Dahlia, reportedly inspired by a popular film of the time. Short had come to Hollywood from Massachusetts with dreams of stardom, but she had struggled to find work, moving from boarding house to boarding house and relying on the generosity of acquaintances. Despite one of the largest investigations in Los Angeles Police Department history, involving more than 150 suspects, her murder was never solved. The case has inspired dozens of books, films, and television shows, including the James Ellroy novel The Black Dahlia and its film adaptation. Elizabeth Short remains one of the most famous murder victims in American history, her name synonymous with the dark side of Hollywood's golden age. From a cold case of the 1940s to a tragedy of the 21st century. At Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, one of the most beautiful and historic cemeteries in all of New York, rests Bashar Jackson, known to the world as Pop Smoke. He was just 20 years old when he was murdered in 2020, and his death cut short what many in the hip-hop world believed would be one of the great careers. Pop Smoke was a Brooklyn-born rapper whose deep voice and commanding delivery made him a sensation in the drill music scene. His breakthrough track, Welcome to the Party in 2019, earned him a major label deal and comparisons to the Notorious B.I.G. A comparison that carried extra weight, given that both were Brooklyn natives. On February 19, 2020, Pop Smoke was staying at a rented home in the Hollywood Hills when several people broke in during the early morning hours. He was shot multiple times and died at a hospital. He was 20. Investigators determined that the killing was a home invasion robbery, and 4 people, 2 of them minors at the time of the crime, were eventually convicted. Pop Smoke's debut album, Shoot for the Stars, Aim for the Moon, was released posthumously in July 2020 and debuted at number 1, going on to become one of the best-selling albums of the year. Let us leave the present day and travel back to the golden age of Hollywood once more. At Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, the same cemetery where Sam Cooke rests, lies Thelma Todd, a beautiful and talented comedic actress whose death in 1935 has puzzled investigators and Hollywood historians for nearly a century. Thelma Todd was known as Hot Toddy and the Ice Cream Blonde. She appeared in more than 100 films during her career, working alongside some of the biggest names in comedy: Laurel and Hardy, the Marx Brothers, Buster Keaton, and Charlie Chase among them. She was also a shrewd businesswoman who ran a popular seaside restaurant and bar on the Pacific Coast Highway called Thelma Todd Sidewalk Cafe. On the morning of December 16, 1935, her body was found slumped behind the steering wheel of her car in the garage of her business partner's home. She was 30 years old. The official ruling was accidental death from carbon monoxide poisoning, but many people suspected foul play. Todd had been receiving threats from organized crime figures who wanted to use her restaurant for illegal gambling. Her ex-husband and her current lover were also considered possible suspects. A grand jury investigation was held, but no charges were ever filed. To this day, whether Thelma Todd was murdered or died by accident remains one of old Hollywood's most tantalizing mysteries. From one mystery to another, perhaps the most debated criminal case of the late 20th century. At St. James Episcopal Cemetery in Marietta, Georgia, lies JonBenet Ramsey, the 6-year-old beauty pageant contestant whose murder on Christmas night 1996 became one of the most heavily covered and endlessly analyzed crimes in American history. JonBenet Patricia Ramsey was found dead in the basement of her family's home in Boulder, Colorado, on December 26, 1996, hours after her mother Patsy had called police to report finding a ransom note. The child had been struck on the head and strangled. Despite a massive investigation, no one has ever been charged with her murder. Suspicion initially fell on JonBenet's parents, John and Patsy Ramsey, but they were cleared by DNA evidence in 2008. The case generated an extraordinary amount of media coverage and public fascination, much of it focused on the unusual world of child beauty pageants that JonBenet had participated in. Patsy Ramsey died of ovarian cancer in 2006, still haunted by the unsolved murder of her daughter. JonBenet was originally buried in Boulder before being moved to the family plot in Marietta. The case remains open, and advances in DNA technology continue to offer hope that the killer may one day be identified. We now come to one of the most recent and shocking entries on our tour, a crime that occurred in December of 2025 and stunned the entertainment world. Director Rob Reiner and his wife, photographer and producer Mikkel Singer Reiner, were found murdered in their Brentwood, Los Angeles home on December 14, 2025. Rob Reiner was one of the most beloved figures in Hollywood. He first became famous as Michael "Meathead" Stivic on the groundbreaking 1970s sitcom All in the Family, opposite Carol O'Connor. He then transitioned to directing and created some of the most cherished films of the 1980s and 90s. This is Spinal Tap, Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, Misery, and A Few Good Men, among others. He was the son of comedy legend Carl Reiner and was known for his liberal political activism as much as for his filmmaking. Michelle Singer Reiner was a photographer, producer, and advocate for LGBTQ rights. They married in 1989 and had 3 children together. On the morning of December 14th, their daughter Romy discovered them in the master bedroom of their home. Both had died of multiple stab wounds. Their 32-year-old son Nick was arrested that night and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Nick had struggled with addiction for much of his adult life, a struggle his father had explored in the semi-autobiographical 2016 film Being Charlie. The case is ongoing. Rob Reiner was 78. Michelle was 70. The entertainment community was devastated by the loss. Billy Crystal, Larry David, and Martin Short were among those who paid tribute to their friends. After that wrenching story, let's visit a musician whose death, though much less well-known, is no less mysterious. Bobby Fuller, the Texas-born rock and roller behind the 1966 hit I Fought the Law, is buried at Forest Lawn Hollywood Hills. He died under circumstances that remain baffling to this day. Bobby Fuller and the Bobby Fuller 4 had just scored a top 10 hit with their explosive cover of I Fought the Law, written by Sonny Curtis of the Crickets. The song crackled with energy and seemed to announce the arrival of a major new talent. On July 18, 1966, Fuller was found dead in his car outside his Hollywood apartment. He was 23. His body had been doused in gasoline, and the car was unlocked with the keys still in the ignition. The Los Angeles police initially ruled it an accident, then considered the possibility that he had taken his own life. Neither explanation satisfied those who knew him. Many suspected foul play, possibly connected to organized crime figures in the Los Angeles music scene. The exact circumstances of Bobby Fuller's death have never been determined, and the case was never formally closed. From one musician to another who met violence at the hands of an intruder. Peter Tosh, the Jamaican reggae legend, is buried at the churchyard in Belmont, Westmoreland Parish, Jamaica, in the rural hills where he was born. Peter Tosh was a founding member of the Wailers, alongside Bob Marley and Bunny Wailer, helping to bring reggae music from the streets of Kingston to the world stage. After leaving the Wailers in 1974, Tosh launched a solo career that produced classics like Legalize It, Equal Rights, and Mama Africa. His duet with Mick Jagger, Don't Look Back, was a hit in 1978. Tosh was known for his outspoken political activism, fearlessly criticizing the Jamaican government and advocating for the legalization of marijuana. On September 11, 1987, 3 armed men burst into Tosh's home in Kingston during a gathering of friends. The intruders demanded money, and when Tosh reportedly told them he had none, they shot him in the head. 2 of his guests were also killed. The lead gunman, Dennis Lepo Loban, was a man Tosh had previously befriended and helped. Loban was eventually convicted of murder and sentenced to death, later commuted to life in prison. Peter Tosh was 42. He was posthumously awarded Jamaica's Order of Merit, the country's 3rd highest honor. From the hills of Jamaica, let us travel across the world to India. At Rajghat in New Delhi, on the banks of the Yamuna River, a simple black marble platform marks the spot where Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, the Mahatma, was cremated. It is one of the most visited and revered sites in all of India. Gandhi, of course, was the leader of India's independence movement, a man who guided an entire nation to freedom through the power of nonviolent resistance. His philosophy of civil disobedience and peaceful protest inspired movements around the world, including the American Civil Rights Movement led by Martin Luther King Jr., whom we visited earlier today. On January 30th, 1948, just months after India achieved independence from British rule, Gandhi was walking to an evening prayer meeting in the garden of Birla House in New Delhi. A Hindu nationalist named Nathuram Godse approached him, bowed as if in greeting, and shot him 3 times at point-blank range. Gandhi died within minutes. He was 78 years old. Godse was tried and executed the following year. Gandhi's assassination was mourned around the globe, and his legacy as one of the most influential figures in human history is beyond dispute. The inscription on the memorial at Raj Ghat reflects the last words attributed to him, "He Ram," meaning, "O God." Let's return now to the United States, to San Francisco, and one of the most important political assassinations in American history. At Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, a veteran cemetery just south of the city, there is a marker for Harvey Milk, the first openly gay man to be elected to major public office in California. Harvey Milk moved to San Francisco in 1972 after years working on Wall Street and in the theater world in New York. He settled in the Castro district, the heart of the city's burgeoning gay community, and opened a camera shop on Castro Street. He quickly became a political force in the neighborhood, organizing local merchants and advocating for the rights of gay men and women at a time when homosexuality was still classified as a mental illness by the American Psychiatric Association. After 3 unsuccessful campaigns, he lost races for the Board of Supervisors in 1973 and 1975, and for the State Assembly in 1976, becoming such a familiar figure that the press dubbed him the Mayor of Castro Street. Milk was elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in 1977, becoming the first openly gay man to be elected to major public office in California, and one of the first in the nation. His tenure on the board, though brief, was marked by his passionate advocacy for gay rights, his considerable charisma, and his ability to build coalitions that crossed lines of race, class, and neighborhood. He sponsored a landmark gay rights ordinance and helped defeat Proposition 6, a statewide ballot measure that would have banned gay men and women from teaching in California's public schools. He had a flair for the dramatic and an instinct for the media, but beneath the showmanship was a man of genuine conviction who understood the power of visibility. "If a gay person makes it," he once said, "the doors are open for everyone." On November 27, 1978, Dan White, a former supervisor who had represented a conservative, largely blue-collar district, entered City Hall through a basement window, deliberately bypassing the metal detectors at the main entrance. White had recently resigned from the board and then asked Mayor George Moscone to reappoint him. Moscone initially agreed, but then, under pressure from Milk and others, decided to appoint someone else. White, feeling betrayed and humiliated, snapped. He went to the mayor's office and shot Moscone 4 times, the final 2 shots fired into his head as he lay on the floor. White then reloaded his revolver, walked down the hall to Harvey Milk's office, and shot him 5 times. Both men died at the scene. Milk was 48, Moscone was 49. White's trial became notorious. His defense team argued that he was suffering from severe depression, citing as evidence his recent shift from a healthy diet to a steady intake of junk food, an argument the press dubbed the Twinkie defense. White was convicted only of voluntary manslaughter rather than first-degree murder, a verdict that enraged the gay community and sparked the White Night riots in San Francisco, during which demonstrators set police cars ablaze outside City Hall. White was sentenced to 7 years and 8 months in prison and was released in January 1984 after serving just over 5 years. Less than 2 years after his release, he took his own life. Harvey Milk had famously recorded several cassette tapes to be played in the event of my assassination. He knew, as a prominent gay politician in a volatile era, that his life was in danger. On one of those tapes, he said, "If a bullet should enter my brain, let that bullet destroy every closet door." The 2008 film Milk, starring Sean Penn, who won the Academy Award for Best Actor for his portrayal, brought Milk's story to a new generation. In 2009, President Obama posthumously awarded Milk the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Our next stop brings us back to the world of celebrity crime and the complicated terrain where Hollywood meets tragedy. At Forest Lawn, Hollywood Hills, Bonnie Lee Bakley is buried. Her name may not be immediately familiar, but her death made headlines because of the man who was charged with, and ultimately acquitted of, her murder, the actor Robert Blake. Bonnie Lee Bakley was a woman with a complicated past. She had a history of using personal ads to meet and manipulate wealthy men, and she was married multiple times. In 1999, she gave birth to a daughter whose paternity was initially disputed between Blake and the singer Jerry Lee Lewis. DNA testing confirmed Blake was the father, and he married Bakley in 2000. On May 4, 2001, the couple had dinner at an Italian restaurant in Studio City. Blake told police he had walked Bakley back to their car, then returned to the restaurant to retrieve a handgun he had left behind. When he returned to the car, he said he found Bakley slumped in the passenger seat with a fatal gunshot wound. She was 44. Blake was charged with murder in 2002 and tried in 2005. He was acquitted, though a civil jury later found him liable for her death and ordered him to pay $30 million in damages. Blake died in 2019, maintaining his innocence to the end. The case remains officially unsolved. Let's step to one of the most chilling stories in our entire tour. One that many of you true crime enthusiasts will know well. At St. Charles Cemetery in East Farmingdale, Long Island, lies the DeFeo family, victims of one of the most infamous crimes in American history and the inspiration for a cultural phenomenon. In the early morning hours of November 13, 1974, 23-year-old Ronald DeFeo Jr. walked through his family's Dutch colonial home at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, Long Island, with a rifle and systematically killed all 6 members of his family as they slept. His victims were his father Ronald Sr. and mother Louise, his sisters Dawn and Allison, and his brothers Mark and John. DeFeo initially ran to a local bar claiming he had discovered the bodies, but he later confessed to the murders. He was convicted on 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 6 concurrent sentences of 25 years to life. He died in prison in 2021. The story might have ended there, but months after the murders, a new family, the Lutzes, moved into the Amityville house and reported experiencing terrifying paranormal activity. Their claims became the basis for Jay Anson's 1977 book, The Amityville Horror, which spawned a massive franchise of films. Whether the Lutzes' experiences were real or fabricated has been debated for decades, but the murders themselves were all too real. The DeFeo family rests together here at St. Charles, their graves a quiet testament to a horror that was never supernatural at all. Our tour has been heavy with tragedy, so let's talk about a different kind of historical figure. Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, who is buried at a monument to the unknown soldier in Cairo, near the location where he was assassinated. Sadat was the 3rd president of Egypt and a man who changed the course of Middle Eastern history. In 1977, he made the bold decision to visit Israel and address the Israeli Knesset, the first Arab leader ever to do so. This extraordinary act of diplomacy led to the Camp David Accords in 1978, a peace agreement brokered by President Jimmy Carter that ended decades of war between Egypt and Israel. For this achievement, Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin shared the Nobel Peace Prize. But the peace deal was deeply unpopular among many in the Arab world, and it made Sadat a target. On October 6, 1981, during a military parade commemorating the anniversary of the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, a group of soldiers led by Lieutenant Khalid Islambouli broke ranks, rushed the reviewing stand, and opened fire. Sadat was struck by multiple bullets and died at a military hospital. He was 62. His funeral was attended by 3 former American presidents, Nixon, Ford, and Carter, but was largely boycotted by Arab leaders. Sadat's courage in pursuing peace at the cost of his own life remains one of the most remarkable stories of the 20th century. Let's cross back to the United States now, to a man whose Academy Award-winning performance was drawn from the most harrowing chapter of his own life. Haing S. Ngor is buried at Rose Hills Memorial Park in Whittier, California, the largest cemetery in North America. Ngor was a Cambodian-American physician and actor who survived one of the 20th century's most horrific genocides. the reign of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia from 1975 to 1979, during which an estimated 2 million people perished from execution, forced labor, starvation, and disease. Ngor, who had been a surgeon in Phnom Penh, was forced to conceal his education. The Khmer Rouge systematically targeted intellectuals and professionals for execution. He endured forced labor camps, starvation, and torture, and watched helplessly as his pregnant wife died during childbirth because he was unable to reveal his medical training to help her without being killed himself. That anguish stayed with him for the rest of his life. After escaping to Thailand and eventually making his way to Los Angeles, Ngor was working as a job counselor for other Cambodian refugees when he was discovered by a casting director for the 1984 film The Killing Fields. The film told the true story of New York Times journalist Sidney Schonberg and his Cambodian colleague Dith Pran, who survived the Khmer Rouge's brutal labor camps. Ngor was cast as Dith Pran. Despite having no acting experience whatsoever, his performance was electrifying and almost unbearably authentic because he had lived through the very horrors he was portraying on screen. He won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, becoming one of only a handful of non-professional actors ever to receive the honor. In his acceptance speech, he dedicated the award to the people of Cambodia. In the years that followed, Ngor became an outspoken advocate for Cambodian refugees and human rights. He wrote a memoir, Haing Ngor, a Cambodian Odyssey, documenting his experiences under the Khmer Rouge. He continued to appear in films and television, including roles in Vietnam War stories and documentaries. On the night of February 25, 1996, Ngor was shot 3 times outside his apartment in the Chinatown neighborhood of Los Angeles in what appeared to be a robbery. He was 55 years old. 3 members of the Oriental Lazy Boys street gang were eventually arrested and convicted of his murder. One of the most heartbreaking details of the case is that Ngor was reportedly wearing a gold locket containing a photograph of his wife, Chiang Mai-Hoi, the only image he had of her, the woman he had been unable to save. According to some accounts, he refused to hand it over to his attackers. A man who had survived the killing fields of Cambodia, who had endured years of torture and starvation and unspeakable loss, was killed in a robbery on the streets of America. The locket was found on his body. We're nearing the end of our journey now, but we have a few more stories to tell, and this next one involves a child. At Twin Palm Cemetery in Whittier, California, lies Judith Barcy, a 10-year-old actress whose life and death are among the most tragic in Hollywood history. Judith Barcy was a remarkably talented child actress who appeared in commercials, television shows, and films throughout the 1980s. Many people know her voice without knowing her name. She was the voice of Ducky in the animated classic The Land Before Time, the little dinosaur who says, "Yep, yep, yep." She also voiced Anne-Marie in All Dogs Go to Heaven. On screen, she appeared in films like Jaws: The Revenge. Behind the scenes, Judith and her mother Maria suffered years of abuse at the hands of her father, Josef Barcy, a Hungarian immigrant who was jealous of his daughter's success and increasingly violent. On July 25, 1988, Josef shot both Judith and Maria as they slept, set the house on fire, and then took his own life. Judith was just 10 years old. Both The Land Before Time and All Dogs Go to Heaven were released posthumously. Judith and Maria are buried together. The dedication at the end of The Land Before Time reads, "In memory of Judith Barcy." It is a fitting epitaph for a child who brought so much joy to so many and whose voice, that bright, sweet, unmistakable voice, continues to delight new generations of children who will never know the sadness behind the smile. And so our tour comes to its end. We have traveled across the country and around the world, from Central Park to Corpus Christi, from Arlington National Cemetery to the hills above Lake Como, from the streets of Memphis to the steps of a mansion in Miami Beach. 50 lives, 50 stories, 50 endings that came too soon and at the hands of another person. Some of these cases were solved in days, others remain mysteries decades later. What connects them all is simply this: behind every famous name, there was a real person. Someone who made music that moved us, who led movements that changed us, who made us laugh, who made us think, who gave us something worth remembering. They deserved better endings. But the work they left behind, the songs, the films, the speeches, the courage, outlives the violence. It always does. Thank you for joining us, friends. Take care of one another. We'll see you next time.